This is TWiT.
Charlie Rose got in a plane, flew to Silicon Valley to talk to Larry Ellison, the CEO and founder of Oracle, one of the richest men in the world.
He was roughing it at Larry's place.
Roughing it at the... Larry doesn't leave the place, so Charlie...
He's not in his kimono.
And I always thought Charlie was a great interviewer, but I have to say this was one of the worst interviews ever. Also, somewhat misrepresented because the headline said, Larry Ellison says Apple is doomed without Jobs.
We saw Apple without Steve Jobs. We saw Apple with Steve Jobs. Now we're going to see Apple without Steve Jobs.
What he says, which is true, and we all know, we've observed many times, that he says we've already done the experiment. Look how Apple did without Steve Jobs the first time. But on follow-up, he doesn't say Apple is doomed by any means.
Well, it's a much different company than it was.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's fair to say Larry sees dark future or anything of the sort.
It was a very carefully chosen clip,
yes.
and it completely lacks context because Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple the first time his favorite sugar water salesman took over, and then he eventually went back. Now he left Apple. He built up an entire culture there. He'd hired Tim Cook and Johnny Ive, and well, he didn't hire him, but he brought Johnny Ive to the position he's in today, and he trained Apple. Apple is, and I think Gruber said this a year ago, Apple is Steve Jobs' biggest product, and that was absolutely not the case when Steve Jobs left the first time. But the thing that I'm curious about most, Leo, is that why we spend so much time paying attention to people who, I mean, he was Steve Jobs' friend, but his claim to fame is being smart enough to sell amongst the worst database technology ever to everybody.
Right.
And I'm not sure what particular insight that gives
yeah,
to the
exactly.
future of Apple.
Well, but he did spend time. In fact, the thing that's worth watching the interview for is him talking about the last days of Steve. He said, I used to go, every week we'd take a walk. The walks got shorter and shorter. Eventually, Steve couldn't take the walk. And a few days before he passed away, Steve, and I did not know this, stopped taking his medication. He said, he basically gave up. He said, I'm in too much pain, it's not worth it. He said Steve was one of the strongest fighters I knew, and when Steve couldn't take it anymore, then you really knew it was over. That is worth watching. The rest of it, who cares what Larry Ellison thinks? He also says that, and it's so amazing because, first of all, Larry never gives interviews, so the fact that he gave an interview, it all becomes much more important than it ought to be. But secondly, he says, he's quoted as saying, Larry Page is evil. He's actually very careful not to say that Larry Page is evil. He's just pissed off that they're suing him over Java, that
right.
Android isn't licensing Java from Oracle. But he's very careful to say, no, he's not evil. And I don't think, it's all reading between the lines to say that Apple is doomed. You saw the thing. He went up with Apple without Steve, he went down. And now we saw Apple without Steve Jobs up, and then now we're going to see Apple without Steve Jobs.
Hand movement.
But he doesn't say doomed by any means. I think what it remains is we don't know what's going to happen. And I think for The Verge and others to say Apple is doomed, Larry Ellison says Apple is doomed, is misquoting him.
Well, it's good. It got people to look at it, got us to talk about it.
Yeah, and I might say that there could have been a better interview, but frankly, it couldn't have gotten more attention. So I guess it depends what your goal is.